Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to Victober. Here we are again, the best time of the year, and today I'm going to be ranking for you 50 different Victorian authors. So, it is Victober once again. This is my first Victober video and I'm just hugely excited that we're back in Victober. So today I thought I would do a ranking video of a lot of Victorian authors. I've been thinking for a while that it would be fun to rank all the Victorian authors that I've read. So I've read quite a lot of Victorian books. I think I've read slightly over 200 works of Victorian literature by 58 different authors. So I thought it might be fun to rank those authors. However, I have taken out some of the authors from my list because I didn't really know how to compare non-fiction writers to fiction writers and poets to prose writers. So this list is a list of novelists, short story writers and playwrights. I mean, there's only 2 playwrights, mostly because I wanted to rank Oscar Wilde on the basis of his plays as well as his novel and his short stories, and therefore it felt weird not to include George Bernard Shaw as well. But anyway, my list of Victorian authors, taking out the poets and the non-fiction writers, came up to 50, which seemed like a nice round number. So today we're going to rank 50 Victorian authors from my least favourite to my favourite. It's going to be a long video, but you know, hopefully a fun one. Obviously I'm going to try and go through these authors very briefly. I have ranked them from 50 to 1, but it is slightly arbitrary, so I've also broken it down into like 2-star authors, 3-star authors, 4-star authors and 5-star authors. So I'll say that as I go along too, because obviously like the difference between number 37 and 36 is very big. And obviously it's quite hard to pitch against each other an author that I've read 1 book by and an author that I've read 14 books by. But you know, I've just tried to do it because I thought it might be fun. But anyway, let's start off with my 2-star Victorian authors. I'll start off with my least favourite Victorian author at number 50. So my least favourite Victorian author, it's not George Eliot, we'll get to her later, it is Bram Stoker. So I've only read 1 book by Bram Stoker, which was Dracula, and I really hate Dracula. I think it's also one of those books that, because I read it and I didn't like it, and then I studied it at A-level, so I've read it like 3 times in quick succession, so that just like made me hate it all the more. I'm not going to go into detail here about why I didn't like Dracula, but I don't like Dracula. Should I try something else by Bram Stoker? Maybe, but right now he is at the bottom as my least favourite Victorian author. At number 49 we have Edward Abbott. I've only read Flatland by him, but I really hated it. Didn't find it an enjoyable read at all, and the gender stuff in it was really odd and unpleasant, and I don't really feel any desire to read anything more by Edward Abbott in the future. At number 48 we have George du Maurier. I've only read 1 book by him, which was Trilby, which I really didn't like. Maybe I should read something else by George du Maurier, I don't know, but I really didn't get on with Trilby, so he is pretty low down on my list. Then number 47, now we get to George Eliot. So George Eliot is an author who I just never know how I feel about. I have a very complicated relationship with her because I really don't like her writing style. It's really not for me. I find reading her books a really dry experience. I find her books quite boring, and every time I've read one of her books there's always been like a minor character who I'm really interested in, who she doesn't spend time on, and she's always spending time on the main characters who I'm really bored by. However, I have read 5 of George Eliot's books. She's probably the author who I like the least, who I've read the most by, because I just keep trying her, because I just really want to like her, because she's this big important Victorian author. Everyone has such interesting things to say about her. She has such an interesting life. I get that her books are important, I just don't like them. So The Mill and the Floss is my least favourite book of all time. I hate it with a passion. Then I've also read Adam Bede and Silas Marner, neither of which I really liked, but I didn't sort of hate them as much as The Mill and the Floss. Then Middlemarch I don't like, but I do respect, and Daniel Deronda I did actually quite like, but I didn't love it. So my relationship with George Eliot is just a bit of a mess, but basically I just really don't like her writing, but I sort of do like the substance of her books and what she's trying to do. I can kind of respect her as an author, except for The Mill and the Floss, I do not respect that book. But the other books by her, especially Middlemarch and Daniel Deronda, I can really respect them, but I just don't get on with her writing at all, and that's completely personal, and that's fine. So she is down pretty near the bottom of the list at number 47. Anyway, at number 46 we have William Makepeace Thackeray. I have read 2 of his books. I read Barry Lyndon last year and didn't like it very much. The main character was very frustrating. He was supposed to be dislikable, but I couldn't handle his dislikability. I have also read Vanity Fair. I read it when I was about 14 or 15, and I don't really remember it very well. I don't remember especially disliking it, I just don't remember liking it very much either. So it might be that at some point I read some more William Makepeace Thackeray and he moves a little higher up this list, but based on my hazy memory of Vanity Fair and my memory of really disliking Barry Lyndon, William Makepeace Thackeray is going quite low down on the list. list. At number 45 we have Charles Kingsley, possibly another unfairly ranked author because I've only read The Water Babies by him and I was very young. Maybe about 10. I don't remember it very well, but I don't remember especially liking it, but, you know, at some point, and maybe I should reread it and I'll have a completely different opinion, and maybe I need to try something else by him. Then at number 44, we have Captain Marryat. I've only read The Children of the New Forest by him, which I read a couple of years ago for Victober, and I didn't really like it very much. I didn't hate it, but it wasn't really my cup of tea, so he's not being ranked very highly either. And that ends the 2-star Victorian author section of this ranking. Those are the authors who I don't really like very much, and now we're moving into the 3-star Victorian authors who I quite like, but I maybe don't have a lot of like wonderful things to say about them, but I have enjoyed their books, but they haven't like hugely stayed with me, so let's move on to them. At number 43 we have Joseph Conrad. The only book I've read by him is Heart of Darkness, which I studied at university, but I don't remember very much about at all. I remember finding it interesting, and there are like a few bits that stay with me, but I don't remember it very well to have like a clear impression of it in my head. I would be kind of interested to read more by Joseph Conrad in the future though, so he is a 3-star author, don't really know how I feel about him yet. At number 42 we have Rhoda Broughton. The only book I've read by her is a short story collection called Twilight Stories, which I quite enjoyed. Twilight Stories was one of those books actually that I didn't rate very highly on Goodreads, but I remembered slightly more fondly than I had rated it, so I don't know if that means I have slightly misremembered it in my head, or if actually it's just stayed with me a bit better than I thought it would. So I quite enjoyed Twilight Stories, but I don't have a really strong impression of Rhoda Broughton in my mind yet, and I really want to read more by her. At number 41 we have Emily Eden. I've only read one book by her, which is The Semi-Detached House, which I quite liked, but I found it a little bit throwaway. At number 40 I have Rudyard Kipling. I have kind of mixed feelings about Rudyard Kipling. I've read 3 of his novels and quite a few of his short stories. So the novels I've read are Kim, The Light That Failed, and The Jungle Book. I didn't really like The Jungle Book, but I did quite like The Light That Failed and Kim. Both of them were books that I felt like I had issues with, but also that I found really, really interesting, and Kim especially I feel like I'd like to reread and sort of like study because it's a very, very interesting book. I'm not really sure how I feel about Rudyard Kipling. He doesn't go very high up this list, but I do want to read more by him, and I would quite like to reread Kim in the future, which isn't the case with, I think most of the books I have mentioned so far, by the authors I've mentioned so far, I don't feel the desire to reread, but Kim is one that I would like to revisit at some point again. At number 39 I have Richard Jefferies. I have read 2 books by him, After London and Green Fern Farm. Green Fern Farm was quite a nice book, but it didn't really stay with me or make an impression on me. After London I feel like is a more interesting book, but again I didn't really like love it. After London, also called Wild England, is a really strange book about like the future of England when it's been like taken over by nature again and has kind of become like medieval, but it's in the future, so it's kind of like really academically interesting. I studied at university, but I don't really love the writing, so Richard Jefferies is fairly middling for me. At number 38 we have Robert Louis Stevenson. He's a hard one to rank for me because I really like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I've also enjoyed some of his short stories, but I really didn't like Treasure Island. I found Treasure Island really dull, which might just be me. I feel like everyone else seems to really like Treasure Island, and maybe it was just me, but I just found it not very exciting at all. So it's hard to rank Robert Louis Stevenson, but he's sitting here in the middle for now. And number 37 is Andrew Forrester. The book by him that I've read is a short story collection called The Female Detective, which is about a female detective. I quite enjoyed those short stories. They were quite interesting. Don't have too much else to say about Andrew Forrester at this point. And number 36, I have Benjamin Disraeli. The only novel by him that I've read is Sybil, which I read quite a long time ago and I quite enjoyed, but it hasn't hugely stayed with me. I really want to read more by Benjamin Disraeli. Aside from anything else, he was, as well as being a novelist, the Prime Minister several times, which I just think is really cool. And at school I studied like Victorian political history, and I looked quite a lot at Gladstone and Disraeli, and they're both kind of really interesting figures and really interesting like personalities. So I'd really like to read Disraeli because he's actually probably one of the authors on this list whose life I know quite a lot about, but I've only read one of his books and I really want to read more. At number 35 I have Jerome K. Jerome. The only book I've read by him is Three Men in a Boat, which isn't a novel that will like hugely stay with me or emotionally impacted me, but it was really good fun. On a similar note, at number 34 I have George and Whedon Grossmith. This is actually two people, but they wrote a book together and that's all I've read, so I'm putting them in together. The only book by them I've read is Diary of a Nobody, which I really enjoyed, but again it's not one that like will have me thinking about it forever, but it was really, really fun. At number 33, I have Richard Marsh. Now, he's another author who I found really hard to rank because I've only read one book by him, which was The Beetle, which I read last October, and I actually found The Beetle quite disappointing in some ways, but I also found it really fascinating, and I also really liked his writing, so I feel like he's an author that I need to read more by. I think one of the issues with The Beetle is that it is a kind of Victorian horror novel, sort of similar to Dracula, but so much better, and one of the reasons why I really liked it was because I felt it was so much better than Dracula. However, it is very of its time and quite problematic in lots and lots of ways, and I found some of the more xenophobic and sexist elements of the plot quite tricky. So The Beetle is one of those books where I found it really, really interesting, and I have thought about it a lot, but also I don't know if I liked it, but also I did think his writing was very good. So I'm kind of interested to read something else by Richard Marsh and see what he's like in the rest of his books. At number 32, we have Alan Rain. I've only read one book by her, which was Garth Owen. Garth Owen is a book that I remember that I really enjoyed at the time, but it hasn't hugely stayed with me. My memory is a little bit hazy, but I would really like to read more by Alan Rain in the future. I think A Welsh Witch is by her, which I've been meaning to read for a while, so hopefully I'll get to that at some point soon. At number 31, I have R.D. Blackmore. I've only read one book by him, which was Lorna Doone. I read Lorna Doone as a teenager, but I remember really, really enjoying it. I'd really like to read more by R.D. Blackmore, and I've been saying that I want to read more by R.D. Blackmore for years, and I just haven't, so I really need to at some point soon. At number 30, I have William Morris. The one thing that I have read by him is News from Nowhere, which is a really interesting and strange book, which is a kind of utopian novel about this socialist utopian future of England. It is very much a Victorian male vision of a socialist utopia where all the economic stuff is really fascinating to read as a modern reader, but also don't forget that now in this utopia all the women are really beautiful. Yeah, William Morris. However, I did quite like News from Nowhere, and William Morris gets a boost because I really love his artwork, which definitely I shouldn't be ranking in the Victorian authors ranking, but somehow that makes me like more fond of William Morris. Anyway, I feel like he should actually be lower down this list, but it's too late, I've committed now. Let's move on. At number 29, we have Lewis Carroll. I've read two of his books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, of course, both of which are good fun, completely bizarre, but I enjoyed them. So that ends the 3-star authors portion of this video. Let's move on to the 4-star authors. So these are authors who I really like. They're not like my favourite authors ever, but I've really enjoyed what I've read by them. At number 28, we have Ella Hepworth Dixon. The book by her that I've read is The Story of a Modern Woman, which is one of the kind of new woman novels of the late 19th century, which I really, really enjoyed. At number 27, we have George MacDonald. I've only read one book by him, which was Alec Forbes of Howglen, which I really, really liked. It's a great Victorian Scottish coming-of-age story, and I really want to read more by George MacDonald, especially some of his children's literature. At number 26, I have Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I've read two books by her, Lady Audley's Secret and Aurora Floyd. Neither of them are like hugely favourite books of mine. Like I liked both of them, but both of them had elements that I found frustrating. However, I love the way that Mary Elizabeth Braddon writes. Like her books are so pacey and so readable, and even though like I found the ending of Aurora Floyd really frustrating, but I found it like such a good reading experience because I love her writing. So I feel like she's one of those authors where even though the two books I've read by her I've had issues with, I do really like the way she writes, and I feel like there'll be other novels by her that I will enjoy quite a bit more as well. At number 25, we have Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I don't really know how to rank Sir Arthur Conan Doyle because he is very hit and miss for me. I love the Sherlock Holmes short stories hugely. I have really, really enjoyed them. I also love his novel The Hound of the Baskervilles, although I think that might be a couple of months too late to be in the Victorian period, or it might be just in the Victorian period. I can never remember. I think it's 1901, but it might have been after Queen Victoria died. But anyway, however, I didn't love A Study in Scarlet, and I really don't like The Sign of the Fool, and I didn't especially love The Mystery of Clumber, but I do love his short stories so much that he kind of gets higher up on this list. But I would say that I much prefer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's short stories to his novels, but as a short story writer he ranks very highly for me, so therefore he gets to be in this interesting space in this ranking. Anyway, at number 24 I have Charlotte Mary Young. I've only read one book by her, which was The Heir of Redcliffe, but I really liked it, and I feel like she's one of these authors where I would like her other books more in future, partly because The Heir of Redcliffe, I feel like it should have been a 5-star read for me. I feel like the next time I read it, it'll be a 5-star read for me. But I feel like the reason why it was a 4-star book for me was because it took me a long time to get into it, because I couldn't work out what it was and what its tone was. So I feel like now I've read one of her books, I feel like I have a clearer idea of what to expect from her other books. So I feel like she will move higher up this ranking as I read more by her. And I feel like she's already like slightly higher up this ranking than my enjoyment of The Heir of Redcliffe would lead her to be. But She's staying here because I do feel like I really like her as an author, even though it took me a long time to get into the air of Redcliffe. At number 23, I have Wilkie Collins. I have no idea how I feel about Wilkie Collins. He's a very, very hit and miss author for me. I'm going to make a whole video about him later on in Victober because I have lots of thoughts about him. I've read, I think, 9 of his books, and hopefully by the time I do the Wilkie Collins video author spotlight, I will have read 10. And some of his books I love, and some of his books I have hated. And some of these books are very middling for me, and I just really don't know, like it really varies from book to book how I feel about Wilkie Collins as an author. I do like his writing, and I do like the way he plays with structure, and I do like his characterization, but there's also lots of things about his books that I struggle with, and there have been some of his books that I've really loathed. So I'm going to do a whole video talking about all of that soon. But yes, he can come in at number 23. At number 22, I have the playwright George Bernard Shaw. I have read 4 of his plays and really enjoyed them all, especially You Never Can Tell. He's a great playwright, one I'd highly recommend, and I wanted to include him in this list, even though most of the rest of them are prose writers. But anyway. At number 21, I have George Moore. So I absolutely loved Drama in Muslin by him, and then I quite liked Esther Waters, but I didn't love it nearly so much. I have also read another book by him, Albert Nobbs, but that wasn't Victorian. I think that's from the 20s, because he was spanning from the Victorian period onwards, so I don't know whether I can rank him on the basis of that here. But anyway, I have enjoyed what I've read by George Moore so far, and I'd like to read more by him in the future. At number 20, I have Frances Trollope. Frances Trollope, if you don't know, was the mother of Anthony Trollope, who we'll hear more about in a minute. I've read 2 books by Frances Trollope, The Widow Barnaby and Michael Armstrong, The Factory Boy, both of which I really enjoyed. I really like her as an author and definitely want to read more by her. At number 19, I have H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells is another author who I didn't really know how to rank. He's obviously most famous for being a science fiction writer, but I don't actually love his science fiction that much. What I love by H.G. Wells is his realist fiction. I do quite like his science fiction, like I quite liked The Island of Dr. Moreau and The Time Machine, but both The Invisible Man and The War of the Worlds I didn't love. And generally I feel like his science fiction is very concerned with ideas and not with characters, and the characterization is very thin on the ground, which I think is the point, but I think that means I get on with his science fiction slightly less well. But I love his realist fiction hugely. Love and Mr. Lewisham was one of my favourite Victorian books, and I also really enjoyed The Wielder's Chance. Those are the 2 of his realist Victorian books that I've read, but H.G. Wells was also writing into the Edwardian period, and I also completely love his book Kipps, and I quite like The History of Mr. Polly as well, both of which were written in the Edwardian period. So do I rank him on the basis of them? I don't know, but even if I did, his science fiction brings him down, though his realist fiction brings him up. But I really like him as an author, and I feel like he's an author I kind of would like to read everything by at some point. So I don't know, maybe he ought to be in the 5-star authors section rather than the 4-star authors section, but it's too late now, I'm going with it. Anyway, that's the end of the 4-star authors section. Let's move on to the 5-star authors and my top 18 who I love a lot. At number 18, I have Harriet Martineau. I've only actually read 1 book by her, which is Deerbrook, but I completely love Deerbrook so much, and I really need to read more by her because I adore Deerbrook hugely. So it's such a fantastic book, and I really clearly need to read a lot more by her. At number 17, another author I definitely need to read more by is Ellen Wood, also sometimes published as Mrs. Henry Wood. The only book I read by her is East Lynne, which is a fantastic Victorian sensationalist novel, which I just loved, and I really need to read more by her because I loved East Lynne so much. At number 16, we have Amy Levy. I've read 2 books by her. First, I read Reuben Sachs, and then I read The Romance of a Shop. I quite liked Reuben Sachs, but then I absolutely loved The Romance of the Shop, and I just think Amy Levy is fantastic. I believe these are the only 2 books that she wrote, which makes me very sad, but I think she's a fantastic writer, and I highly recommend them, especially The Romance of the Shop. And at number 15, I have Amy Dillwyn. Again, similar pattern. I first read The Rebecca Writer, which I really liked, and then I read Jill, which I loved. Jill is fantastic and such a weird, wonderful Victorian book that I highly recommend. So I really recommend Amy Dillwyn. She is a fantastic author. At number 14, we have George Meredith. George Meredith is another author who I've only read 1 novel by, and that is The Egoist. I have also read some of his poetry, but we're not ranking him on that basis here. We're just ranking him on the basis of 1 novel. I really need to read more by George Meredith. I've got 1 book by him on my TBR for Victober. I read The Egoist several years ago now, and I absolutely loved it. It's probably about 6 years ago, and I loved it, but it was the most difficult Victorian book I've ever read. He's a very tricky author, or at least certainly The Egoist was very heavy going, but it was so good, and I just really want to read more by him, and I love The Egoist very much. So George Meredith, despite the fact I've only read 1 of his books, gets a very high place on this list. At number 13, we have Oscar Wilde. I really love Oscar Wilde a lot. I've read his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I love. I've read several of his short stories. I especially love The Canterville Ghost, and I've also read a lot of his plays, my favourite being A Woman of No Importance. Oscar Wilde is a wonderful writer in lots of different mediums, and I highly recommend his work. At number 12, I have J. Sheridan Le Fanu, who is one of my favourite Victorian writers. He's a fantastic Gothic writer who writes wonderful things. I've read his vampire novella, Carmilla. I've read his Gothic sensationalist novel, Uncle Silas, and his work of historical fiction, The House by the Churchyard, all of which I loved. And I've also read a couple of his short stories. I would highly recommend J. Sheridan Le Fanu. He is fantastic, and he is like the master of suspense. I think his books are so good. At number 11, we have Margaret Oliphant. I've read 7 of her books and really enjoyed them all. My favourite by a mile is Hester, which I think is a fantastic novel. And Margaret Oliphant wrote a lot of books. She was very prolific, so I'm very excited to read more by her in the future because her books are just fantastic, and there's a lot of them which I've yet to get to. At number 10, we have the first mention of the Bronte sister, which is Anne Bronte. I've read both her novels, Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, both of which I love, especially The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I think is a real masterpiece, and I highly recommend it. It's a truly fantastic book. At number 9, I have Geraldine Dewsbury. So I've read 2 books by Geraldine Dewsbury, The Half-Sisters and Zoe. I quite liked Zoe, but I didn't love it, actually. But The Half-Sisters I love so much that Geraldine Dewsbury still gets to number 9 on my ranking. The Half-Sisters is one of my favourite books of all time, and I think it's incredible, and I'm really excited to read more by Geraldine Dewsbury in the future. I've got Marianne Withers on my TBR for this Victober, and The Half-Sisters is one of those books that just has like such a big impact on me and which I just adored, so I highly recommend Geraldine Dewsbury, especially The Half-Sisters. At number 8, I have Dinah Muloch-Craik. I've read 2 of her books, Olive and John Halifax Gentleman, both of which I loved very much, but especially Olive is one of my favourite Victorian novels, and I think Dinah Muloch-Craik is such a fantastic author. I can't wait to read more by her. I've got A Noble Life on my TBR for this Victober. I just think she's wonderful, and yeah, such a fantastic author. Can't wait to read everything she's ever written. She's such a fantastic writer, and she looks really powerfully at gender and disability and the people who are kind of like left behind by conventional Victorian life. And she also writes wonderfully about growing up. Like, I just think her books are incredible, and I love her very much. At number 7, we have Emily Bronte. Yes, she only wrote 1 novel, but Wuthering Heights is one of my favourite books of all time. It probably is in my top 5. It's in my top 5. Is it number 4? Maybe it's number 4. It's in my top 5, and I love it hugely, and it's one of my most reread books. And there's just something about Wuthering Heights which always captures me, and I love the writing and the weirdness of it and the complete like bizarre strangeness of it as a book. So Emily Bronte gets high up on this list because I love her very much. At number 6, we have George Gissing. I have read 5 of George Gissing's books, and he's a slightly odd author where 4 of the 5 books by him I've read have been like 5-star books that I absolutely loved, but then I have also read The Whirlpool, which I didn't really like so much. However, on the basis of those other 4 books, he's still one of my favourite authors. I love the way that he writes about late Victorian London, about poverty and social mobility and the kind of like fragility of class structures in the Victorian period. His books are very grim but very wonderful, and I highly recommend his works. Talking of an author who's very grim but very wonderful, at number 5 I have Thomas Hardy. I have read all 14 of his novels, as well as quite a lot of his short stories. I also love his poetry, but we're not ranking people on the basis of poetry here. But anyway, I love Thomas Hardy very much. I think his novels are fantastic. My favourites are probably Jude the Obscure and Far from the Madding Crowd, but I also have a very big place in my heart for The Woodlanders, which is fantastic too, and much more underrated than Jude the Obscure and Far from the Madding Crowd, so I always like to mention that too. I just think Thomas Hardy is wonderful. I love the way he writes about social issues in rural areas. I love the way that he writes about like out-of-the-way places and how landscape affects people, and I love the way that he writes about class and gender as well. I feel like the way he explores social issues is so great, and yes, his books are sometimes very sad, but I also feel like he has moments of real like happiness and human connection, and I feel like Hardy is all about those like moments of happiness that are like snatched away by the end, and I just love his books very much indeed. At number 4, I have Charlotte Bronte, so I've read all 4 of Charlotte Bronte's novels. I have to say, I don't love The Professor, but I do really like Shirley, and Villette and Jane Eyre are 2 of my favourite books of all time. Jane Eyre especially has such a big place in my heart because it was the novel that got me into Victorian literature. It's the reason why I am the person I am today. Can I say that? I don't know. I feel like so much of my personality is like centered around the fact that I really love books and that I really love Victorian books and the Victorian period historically, and I'm reading Victorian literature, and basically that's all Jane Eyre. So if I hadn't read Jane Eyre when I was 13, would I be a completely different person? Possibly. But I also love Villette and Shirley, and The Professor's alright, and I really love the way that she writes and the way that she explores her characters, the way she explores the position of women. I feel like her books are so wonderful and so like psychologically rich and complex, and I just love her a lot as an author. So Charlotte Bronte gets number 4 on this list, and I love her very much. And number 3, we have the wonderful Anthony Trollope, who is my 3rd favourite Victorian authors, one of my favourite authors of all time, and I think the author on this list I have read the most books by, because I have read 28 of his novels. However, he did write 47, so I'm not that far through his works. I have also read some of his short stories, and I just really love him as an author. I love his characterization. I love the way that I feel like his plotting is always like really on point, and that I can really like trust him to give me the plot that I want. I love his books so much. His characterization is fantastic. So I highly recommend the Barsetshire Chronicles. I highly recommend The Way We Live Now and He Knew He Was Right and The Claverings and so many more books. I did a ranking on Anthony Trollope before, so I'll link that down below, but I love him very much. He is a truly wonderful author. And number 2 is Elizabeth Gaskell. I've read her 7-ish novels and an awful lot of her shorter works. The reason why I say 7-ish novels is because Elizabeth Gaskell wrote some longer things, and then she wrote some sort of novellery things, and some of her novellas are sometimes counted as novels and sometimes they're counted as short stories. So like Lois the Witch and A Dark Night's Work and Cranford, I see them in various lists as short stories or novellas or as novels. But I've read all of Elizabeth Gaskell's longer works, and I've read a lot of her shorter works too, and I love her hugely. She's a fantastic writer. I love how different all her novels are, how she could write like fantastic industrial novels and wonderful like coming of age stories set in rural areas, and also like small town novels, and also like really gothic suspenseful novels. Like I feel like all her books are so different, and that's one of the things that is so wonderful about them. I highly recommend Elizabeth Gaskell. She's a fantastic writer. Her characterization is immaculate, and I love her hugely. But number 1, of course, is the wonderful Charles Dickens, who is my favourite author of all time. I've read all his 14 finished novels plus his unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. I've read his 5 Christmas books, and I've read 2 of his non-fiction books, The Uncommercial Traveller and American Notes. I've also read quite a lot of his short stories, although there are still many more for me to discover. I love Dickens hugely for many reasons. If I tell you all the reasons why I love Dickens, this video will be even longer than it already is, so we're not going to go into that, but he is just a fantastic author in every way. He is my favourite, and I love him. I love the strangeness of his language. I love his twisty plots. I love the fact that his novels have so many characters and so many plots all weave together in the most wonderful way, and I just find his books an utter joy to read and to reread, and I know I will be rereading them forever. So there we have it. That's my least to my most favourite Victorian author. Sorry if this video has been eternally long, but I had lots of fun making it, so do let me know down in the comments who your favourite and your least favourite Victorian author are. Welcome to Victober. I hope you're excited. What are you going to be reading? That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.